Okay, so to wrap everything up, I'm going to try to show what's going on in the middle between these early visual responses and these high-level responses that Domenico just talked about. So, when we want to understand and interact with the world around us, event timing is very important. Humans have the ability to combine our senses of timing from vision, hearing, and touch, and also to make skilled movements that follow this timing. Such timing perception is most relevant for events under 1 second because most dynamic events in the world are quick, last under 1 second. Okay. Despite the central role of timing in perception, multisensory integration, action planning, and attention, the mechanisms of temporal processing in the brain are only beginning to be understood. As other speakers have made very clear, this is not understood anywhere near as well as spatial processing in the brain. Okay. But following similarities in perceptual properties, we hypothesize that the processing of event timing might rely on similar mechanisms to space and number processing, which are things I've worked on a lot over the previous years. Okay. So how are space and number represented and processed in the brain? Well, we have many brain areas with neurons that give tuned responses to specific regions of space, that is to say receptive fields. Okay. And we also know that neurons responding to similar regions of space are grouped together. Here we can see the visual field positions in different colors that produce the largest response at each location. And these visual positions gradually vary across the brain's surface, forming a hierarchy of topographic maps of visual space. Other brain areas contain neurons with tuned responses to numerosity. They change their response amplitude parametrically with the number of objects in the display. We've previously shown that different numerosities, here shown in different colors, that produce the largest response at each cortical location also gradually change across the brain's surface, producing a network of topographic maps for number processing as well, so responding to the number of objects that we're seeing, much like we see responses to visual space. Some recent findings suggest that there may be similar tuned neural responses for visual event timing. So first, as Domenico briefly introduced, adapting to a specific short event duration repels the perceived duration of events within a nearby range afterwards for a short period of time. And such repulsive after effects, adaptation effects like this, are often taken to demonstrate neural tuning for the adapted parameter because basically the response can be pushed in either direction by adapting to a shorter or a longer stimulus in this case. Also, in the supplementary motor area, there's tuning for the timing of motor events. Okay. So macaques can be trained to continue repetitively tapping a lever after synchronizing their movements to a visual flash or auditory beep. And if you take measurements during this continuation phase when the sensory stimulus is finished, this reveals tuned responses to the interval between the movements that animals are making. Okay. So this is also tuning for event timing, but importantly, it's for the period between movements, the interval between movements, rather than the duration of the movements themselves. So we wanted to extend the idea of timing-tuned neural populations using 7 Tesla functional MRI, and we gradually varied 2 parameters of the timing of these events. First was the duration that the dot was on the display. Okay, this is the time between the dot's onset and the offset. So what you see here is a dot appearing once every second, but then how long it stays on the screen is changing. Okay. Second, we changed the period between 2 dot appearances, the time between 2 onsets. Okay. And so here the event is always a 50 millisecond flash, but we change how spaced out those events are in time. And we also included a third condition where the event duration and the event period change together so that there's always a dot on the screen. As soon as one disappears, another one appears immediately. And this keeps the luminance of the display constant. Okay, so this is a nice low-level visual property. Okay. So the subject's task in all of these cases is not to make a timing judgment at all. All right? They just pressed a button whenever they saw a white dot, all right, which you may have noticed in looking at this, instead of a black dot. And this is really easy, and it doesn't get easier or harder depending on how long and how frequent the events are. This is just a very easy task, and it checks that our subjects are awake. But other than that, they're basically viewing passively, and they don't need to pay attention to the timing of the events, though they probably are anyway. So we can see any repetitive event's timing as a point in a two-dimensional space of event duration on the x-axis here, and event period on the y-axis. Here we can see the conditions where only duration is changing, so at the top here, okay, where only period is changing, and where they're changing together on the diagonal here. Okay. So for each voxel, we can then fit a two-dimensional Gaussian tuning function, okay, to capture the responses to all of these conditions together, right, using one model. To better constrain this tuning function, we included a fourth set of stimulus timings to kind of fill in the gaps in the middle of this space rather than just measuring around the edges. Okay. So the nature of this tuning function can tell us a lot. All right. So here we see a tuning function where there's no real relationship between the preferred duration and the preferred frequency, that is to say the peak of the tuning function. We see here that the preferred duration is about 250 milliseconds, and the preferred period is around 800 milliseconds. Those are unrelated to each other. But it's quite possible that the duration and period preferences might be strongly correlated. So here we see a case where the duration and the period preference are basically the same. It's also possible that the tuning functions might be elongated in one dimension, perhaps supporting better discriminability of one of these dimensions than the other. So this has narrow tuning in the duration direction, okay, so this would give a very fine representation of duration, and a much broader tuning in the period direction. Okay. Or the tuning function may be angulated such that the preferred duration depends on the period and vice versa. So the peak that you see will change depending on the duration, and will change depending on the period. Okay. So to estimate the properties of this tuning function, we used a extension of the population receptive field modeling approach. I'm going to warn you here that this is a little bit complicated. If you want a more detailed explanation, come to my poster on Thursday, which I'll bring up at the end. So what we do here is we know when every event happened in our stimulus, specifically when every event ended. Okay, and this is the vertical lines in this description of all of these different stimulus sequences, the 4 different sequences that we used. Okay. And then we can have a candidate neural tuning model like this, right? So this has a particular preferred duration, a particular frequency, preferred period, and a spread in each of those. Okay. And so we can then look at the stimulus states that we showed, these dots here, okay? And for each of the stimulus sequences, we can evaluate the tuning function. All right? So what you see here is basically they're just slices through this tuning function. And we can then look at how these one-dimensional projections overlap with the stimulus timings that we're showing. And this tells us what neural response we would expect to see to every event at every point in time, depending on its amplitude in this tuning function, which is a function of its preferred duration and preferred frequency. Okay. All right, so that's the start of it. All right. But there's more to it as well. We do not assume a linear increase in response amplitude with increasing event duration. Following John's approach pretty closely, we allow a sub-additive scaling of response amplitude with increasing event frequency. Okay. And all of that together allows us to convolve our predicted neural response time course with a hemodynamic response function, and that gives us a predicted fMRI response time course that we would expect to see if this tuning function at the top here was responding to this stimulus sequence. All right. Then we can compare that to the responses that we actually measure for every voxel in the brain, okay? And we can see how well they match up. We can then change the parameters of both the two-dimensional neural tuning function up here and the compressive exponent, the compressive nonlinearity that John introduced here, okay, until the fMRI response prediction and the fMRI response data for this voxel fits as well as possible. And so we end up with a series of parameters: the preferred duration, the preferred frequency, the extent of this tuning function, the angulation of this tuning function, and the compressive exponent that we see here. Okay. So there are several areas where such models capture the responses very well. Okay. If we project the preferred durations and the preferred periods onto the cortical surface in these areas, we see that these areas contain a range of preferred durations and preferred periods. And we can also see that within these areas, the preferred duration and the preferred period are strongly correlated. Okay. They consistently fall just above the unity line, so duration preferences are consistently a little longer than period preferences. Furthermore, within these areas, the preferred duration and the preferred period, here shown as black and blue lines, gradually and repeatably change across the cortical surface, forming a series of topographic maps of event timing. We can also characterize the tuning function's extents, right? So it has a long axis and a short axis, right? And so we can see that in the more posterior maps, which is what we're seeing here, the long axis extent and the short axis extent both increase in extent as preferred duration increases. But beyond this first map, which is in the lateral occipital cortex, okay, we start seeing a different pattern. So we start seeing that the tuning functions, particularly the major axis of the tuning function, the long axis, gets narrowest around the middle of the presented range here, so about 0.5 seconds. Okay. And indeed, as we get to the more anterior maps, so in these last two are in the frontal lobe, okay, we see that this dip at the middle is really the only thing that we see, and we don't really see this increase in tuning width with preferred duration. Okay, so we can also take the average of the tuning function size within each of these maps, and we see that for the major axis of the tuning function, here shown for both the left and the right hemispheres at the top here, the tuning function gets smaller and smaller along its major axis as we go from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. Okay. But there's no actual change for the minor axis of the tuning function. That doesn't change significantly between brain areas within this network. Okay. So because the long axis gets smaller, so decreases, while the short axis isn't really changing, the elongation of the tuning function decreases from posterior to anterior timing maps. Throughout this hierarchy, the orientation of the tuning function remains pretty similar, around 45 degrees, right, diagonal. So a typical tuning function would look something a bit like this. All right. So here, the event duration that will produce the largest response depends on the event period, and vice versa, because this tuning function is angulated. Okay. So allowing a tuning function to have an elongated and angulated shape improves the fit of our tuning model in cross-validated data. This fit can be further improved if we don't assume a linear scaling between event frequency and response amplitude, following what John was talking about earlier. And so we can fit a compressive exponent to allow a variable extent of subadditivity of response amplitude to repeated events, more or less following John's approach, and that explains some more variance in the cross-validated data. The compressive exponent that we estimate, as we go from posterior maps to anterior maps, again, the resulting compressive exponent decreases from almost 1, that is to say effectively linear summation of responses to repeated events, down quite close to 0, which is a very minimal summation of responses to repeated events. So, both this compressive exponent and the tuning function's properties change gradually from posterior to anterior timing maps, and they also change from inferior to superior up the precentral and postcentral sulci. Okay. So this suggests a hierarchy of temporal processing in these approximate directions from visual areas at the back of the brain, through multisensory integration areas in the parietal sulcus, to motor planning areas in the frontal sulcus. The areas showing tuned responses to visual event timing largely overlap with areas showing tuned responses to numerosity, which we've looked at before in the same subjects. Okay? Though we often see voxels or areas where you see a response to one to timing but not numerosity, and vice versa. Okay. So to conclude, we see neural tuning for visual event timing in the human brain throughout an extensive network of areas that are implicated in visual motion processing, in attention control, in multisensory integration, and in action planning. We see correlated and interacting tuning for duration and period, which suggests that these might be estimated by closely related computations. We find that posterior maps show a tuning width increase with preferred duration, whereas anterior maps decrease their tuning functions extent around the middle of the presented range, which may support, for example, this is a bit of a hand-wavy explanation, we don't have any evidence for this, this may support more precise motor timing at the middle of the range of events that you're currently seeing. Okay, so that's the most useful range for your current actions. We see a hierarchy from posterior to anterior areas and also from inferior to superior areas, in which we see smaller, less elongated tuning functions. We see an increasing focus on the middle of the presented range, and we see increasingly sub-additive response amplitude compression. So this, again, may be because we're used to seeing more frequent visual events and performing less frequent motor actions, and this would fit with optimizing for those different things. Okay. We also see that this largely overlaps with the numerosity map network that we've previously described, perhaps giving sort of generalized quantity processing in the brain. So the bigger picture of all of this is that we all know that cells that fire together wire together. Okay. But there's also this concept, the minimal wiring hypothesis, that neurons that respond similarly so that they can communicate over minimal distances are often brought together. Okay, so they often lie together in the brain. All right. So this means that local neural populations of the spatial scale that we can measure with functional MRI, particularly at 7 Tesla, contain neurons that respond similarly. Okay, so response preferences should change gradually across the cortical surface following these two ideas. So this suggests that tuned neural response preferences and their organization should be accessible and measurable at the spatial scale of 7T functional MRI. And this isn't just for space, number, and timing. We think this may also be true of higher-level cognitive processes as well. So finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project, our funding agencies, and I'd like to point to my poster presentation where you can come and talk to me about this in more detail if you're interested. That's on Thursday, poster number 400. Thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions now.